One man, one presidency, and a nation deeply divided over what he represents. To millions of Americans, Donald Trump is a political fighter who challenged Washington, protected American interests, and promised to put America first. To millions of others, he is a deeply controversial leader whose words and policies have intensified political division. But beyond the headlines, the rallies and the arguments, one question remains. What kind of president was Donald Trump? To understand that question, we have to go back to the beginning. Before entering the White House, Trump was already one of the most recognizable businessmen and television personalities in America. He built a public image around real estate, wealth, confidence, and an unconventional style that separated him from traditional politicians. Then in 2015, he entered the presidential race. His message was direct: strengthen the southern border, reduce illegal immigration, renegotiate trade relationships, bring manufacturing jobs back to America, and put American interests ahead of global expectations. His supporters saw something they believed Washington had been missing. For years, a leader willing to challenge the political establishment and speak without the language of traditional politicians. But his critics saw a very different picture. They argued that Trump's rhetoric was often divisive, and that his approach to immigration, race, the media, and political opponents created tensions that went far beyond ordinary political disagreement. Then came November 2016. Against many expectations, Donald Trump won the Electoral College and became the 45th President of the United States. For his supporters, it was a political revolution. For his opponents, it was the beginning of a dangerous new chapter in American politics. And once Trump entered the White House, the promises of the campaign had to become actual policies. His presidency would soon be judged not only by what he said, but by what happened to the American economy, jobs, immigration, foreign policy, trade, and the country's political culture. Some decisions would earn him strong praise, others would trigger fierce criticism, and some would remain controversial long after he left office. So was Donald Trump a president who made America stronger? Or did his leadership create costs that were too high? To find out, we have to look beyond the political slogans and examine the record. When Donald Trump entered the White House in January 2017, he inherited an economy that was already growing, but he promised to accelerate that growth and reshape the way Washington did business. One of his biggest priorities was the American economy. Trump pushed for major tax cuts, arguing that lower taxes would encourage businesses to invest, expand, and create more jobs inside the United States. His administration also pursued deregulation, saying that excessive government rules were making it harder for American companies to compete. Supporters point to the economic performance before the COVID-19 pandemic as one of the strongest parts of his presidency. Unemployment fell to historically low levels, including very low rates for several demographic groups, while the stock market reached record highs. For Trump's supporters, this was evidence that his economic strategy was working. But his critics offered a different interpretation. They argued that the economy's expansion had already begun before Trump took office and that the tax cuts also increased the federal deficit. Some economists questioned how much of the economic growth could be directly credited to Trump's policies. Then there was trade. Trump took a much tougher approach toward China than many previous presidents. His administration imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, accusing Beijing of unfair trade practices and intellectual property violations. The strategy was popular among Americans who believed China had benefited from the existing global trade system at America's expense. But tariffs also created new tensions. American farmers, manufacturers, and consumers faced economic pressure in some sectors, while China responded with tariffs of its own. The debate became a larger question about what America's relationship with the world economy should look like. Trump also made immigration one of the defining issues of his presidency. He pushed for stronger border security and continued construction of barriers along parts of the southern border. His administration argued that stronger enforcement was necessary to protect national security and maintain control over illegal immigration. Critics, however, condemned several immigration policies, arguing that they were too harsh and raised serious humanitarian concerns. And then, just as Trump's presidency was approaching one of its most consequential moments, America and the entire world was hit by an unprecedented crisis. COVID-19 changed everything. The economy collapsed, millions of Americans lost jobs, businesses closed, and the federal government took extraordinary measures to respond. For Trump, the pandemic would become one of the most difficult tests of his presidency and one of the most controversial chapters of his political career. But the pandemic did more than damage the economy. It changed the political landscape of the United States. Trump's response became one of the most debated parts of his presidency. Supporters argued that his administration moved quickly to support businesses, develop vaccines, and provide massive economic assistance to Americans. Critics argued that his public messaging about the virus was sometimes inconsistent and that the federal response was not strong enough. Then came another historic moment, the 2020 presidential election. Trump lost the election to Joe Biden, but he refused to accept the result, arguing that the election had been affected by widespread fraud. His legal team challenged the results in multiple states, but courts rejected many of those claims for lack of sufficient evidence. For millions of Trump supporters, however, doubts about the election remained. The dispute reached its most dramatic point on January 6, 2021, when a crowd of Trump supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol as Congress was preparing to certify the election results. The attack shocked the country. Trump was impeached for a second time by the House of Representatives, making him the first U.S. president to be impeached twice. He was later acquitted by the Senate. To his critics, January 6th became a defining example of the dangers of Trump's political movement. His supporters viewed the events through a very different lens, arguing that the concerns surrounding the election deserved attention and that Trump remained the leader of a key movement that Washington had failed to understand. But regardless of political opinion, one fact was impossible to ignore. Donald Trump had fundamentally changed American politics. His presidency had reshaped the Republican Party, transformed the national debate over immigration and trade, challenged traditional political alliances, and created a political movement that continued even after he left the White House. And Trump himself was not finished. After leaving office, he remained one of the most influential figures in American politics. His supporters wanted him back. His opponents were determined to stop him. And the next presidential election would reveal just how powerful the Trump movement had become. But the story did not end with the Capitol attack. Instead, it marked the beginning of another chapter. After leaving the White House, Donald Trump remained at the center of American politics. His influence inside the Republican Party remained remarkably strong, and millions of Americans continued to attend his rallies and support his political movement. Trump presented himself as a leader who had been targeted by political opponents and the media, while his critics argued that he continued to undermine trust in democratic institutions. Then came the legal battles. Trump faced multiple criminal investigations and indictments after leaving office. His supporters described the cases as politically motivated attacks designed to prevent him from returning to power. Critics argued that the investigations were necessary because no president should be above the law. The country was once again divided. But Trump turned that controversy into political energy. He announced another presidential campaign, promising to restore what he called strength, security, and prosperity to America. His message focused heavily on immigration, inflation, crime, energy, and America's position in the world. For many voters, the most important issue was simple. They believed life had become more difficult and wanted a leader who promised dramatic change. Others remained deeply concerned about Trump's character, his attacks on political opponents, and the events surrounding the 2020 election. Then came another historic election. Trump returned to the national stage with a political movement that had survived, and that opportunity became reality. Donald Trump returned to the White House, beginning a second presidency that immediately carried the weight of everything that came before it. For his supporters, his return was more than a political victory. It was proof that a movement they believed had been dismissed could survive enormous pressure and come back stronger. For his critics, however, his return raised serious questions about the future of American democracy, political stability, immigration, executive power, and the relationship between the president and the institutions of government. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Donald Trump himself. Because judging a president is rarely as simple as calling him good or bad. Trump's supporters point to his focus on border security, American industry, tax cuts, deregulation, conservative judicial appointments, and a foreign policy centered on American interests. His critics point to political polarization, controversial immigration policies, attacks on opponents and the media, concerns surrounding January 6th, and his continued challenges to the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Both perspectives are part of the historical record, and perhaps that is the most important lesson of the Trump era. A president can create policies that some Americans celebrate while others strongly oppose. A leader can inspire millions and alarm millions at the same time. And political history is rarely written in black and white. Donald Trump changed the Republican Party. He changed the way presidential campaigns communicate. He changed the national conversation about immigration, trade, the media, and America's role in the world. But perhaps his greatest impact is something less measurable. He revealed just how deeply divided America had become. Behind every poll number, every rally, every protest, and every election result are ordinary Americans with different fears, hopes, beliefs, and dreams for their country. Some see Trump as the leader who finally listened to them. Others see him as a warning about what happens when political divisions become too deep. But whether someone supports Donald Trump or strongly opposes him, one fact is difficult to deny. His name has become a defining part of modern American history. And his story is still being written, because presidents eventually leave the White House. Political movements rise and fall. Elections come and go. But the choices a nation makes and the lessons it learns from them can last for generations. So perhaps the final question is not simply, was Donald Trump a good president or a bad president? Perhaps the better question is, what did the Trump era teach America about itself? The answer belongs not to one politician, one party, or one side of the political divide. It belongs to the American people. And history ultimately will be the judge.